War-Torn, a Peaky Blinders prequel. Part 1, August 1919. A section of soldiers, dressed in uniform, marched down the main road of Small Heath, Birmingham. They had been discharged and no longer needed to walk in such strict formation, but old habits died hard. The section had 3 clear leaders. They guided the rest of the men through the empty street towards the waterway. It was early morning and the day's work had not yet begun. The soldiers gathered at the canal's edge and stood staring at the dark waters below them. One of them placed a cigarette into his mouth and struck a match to light it as he crouched down. His name was Thomas Shelby. Thomas yanked his 2 medals from his chest, ripping his uniform, and brought them close to his eyes. "No place like home, eh?" he said. A couple of grunts and silence were his answer. Thomas sighed. He dropped the medals into the depths, then stood up and walked away, parting the soldiers before him. To a man, every soldier tore their medals from their uniforms and threw them into the water, joining Thomas's forever at the bottom. Polly Gray sat facing her mirror. She grimaced at the lines around her face, then stopped. Grimacing made them worse. Years of hardship from the Great War had aged her beyond her years. The victory would, hopefully, put an end to the stress. The boys would be back any day now. She wondered if things would go back to how they used to be. A knock at the door. Maybe today was the day. Or maybe someone had come to tell her they were dead. No, a letter would have been sent. Enlisted boys from Small Heath were not special enough for personal home visits. Polly tiptoed down the stairs and reached for the door handle with trembling fingers. She opened the door and gasped. Her 3 nephews, Arthur, Thomas and John, looked thin and exhausted. She could see immediately that their youth had been stripped from them. Their eyes were hard and dull, their mouths flat. They expressed no happiness at the sight of her. "All right, Pol," said Thomas. Polly stood aside as he stepped into the hallway. Arthur and John muttered, "All right, Pol," in the same blank tone as they strode in after Thomas. Thomas scanned the living room, with its soft armchairs and decorative gypsy lamps. He pulled off his beret, threw it onto the sofa and turned back to the front door. "Let's go to the fucking pub," he said. The 3 men ducked outside. Polly stood in silence. That was their reunion, over as soon as it had begun. She knew then that things would never be as they were before. The brothers sat at the table closest to the door. Their eyes shifted from face to face. They recognized the older ones, the last survivors of France who had limped back to Small Heath with them. The younger men in the pub smirked arrogantly at the Shelbys, as if daring them to justify their presence. Arthur's upper lip twitched. John scowled, rolling a toothpick from one side of his mouth to the other. Thomas ignored them all. He sat stiffly, staring at the whiskey in front of him. All those years in France, he had dreamed of enjoying a cold glass of whiskey in the garrison. The reality felt incomplete. Or perhaps he was. "You're on our table," said a voice. Thomas looked up. A young man covered in coal dust stood over him, making his posture as intimidating as he could. Thomas returned his eyes to the whiskey glass. The boy was one of those who had been too young to go to France when the war broke out. "It's a free country," Thomas replied. "We made sure of that." The young man slammed his hand on the table. Thomas instinctively reached for his shoulder to grab the rifle that was no longer there. He would have to get hold of a new weapon. "Move your fucking asses, or we'll move 'em for ya," said the youth. 3 other men, barely past puberty, stepped in behind him. John smiled. "They seem to have forgotten who we are," he said. Arthur put down his drink and smoothed his hair back. "Maybe we should remind them," he replied. The two brothers glanced at Thomas, as if waiting for his agreement. Without warning, Thomas grabbed the glass of whiskey and swung it at the head of the closest man. The glass shattered, the whiskey splashing across the man's face as he cried out. John and Arthur flew into action, swinging their fists into the heads and bodies of their attackers. The four men quickly went down, leaving the Shelbys with bleeding knuckles and dishevelled hair. Thomas took a deep breath and looked around the pub. Everyone avoided his eyes. From now on, this table belongs to us, he said, by order of the Peaky Blinders. Part 2. September 1919. The two Italians were sobbing on their knees. They hung limply between two silent members of the Peaky Blinders, who held them up by their coats. The Italians' eyes brightened as they saw Thomas walking towards them. "Tom," the one on the right said. Thomas recognised him as Felipe. "We didn't know it was a Peaky Blinders warehouse. You'll let us go, just this once, won't you, Tom? For old time's sake?" Thomas stared blankly at the man and said nothing. The other man, Franco, began spluttering. "We'll pay for all the stuff we took, Tom, and the damages. You won't kill us, will you? Greta wouldn't want you to kill us." Thomas turned his head and stared at Franco. He and Felipe were cousins of Greta Gerossi. They had met several times, at family gatherings, when Greta was still alive. But that was before the war. Greta was no longer of this world, and acts of violence against the Peaky Blinders could not go unpunished. These Italians had beaten warehouse workers under Peaky Blinder payroll. If the gang showed weakness, the residents of Small Heath would know their protection payments counted for nothing. Thomas reached inside his jacket. Felipe knew what the movement meant and cried out. "We're your family, Tom. What would Greta think? Have mercy, for God's sake." Thomas hesitated for a second, then pulled out his gun and fired a well-aimed shot at each of the men's chests. They collapsed as their souls left their bodies, and the Peaky Blinder boys shoved what was left to the ground. "Throw them in the cut," Thomas said, as he turned away. Nowhere in Small Heath could provide Thomas with a feeling of peace like his childhood home. The Shelbys had bought the houses on either side, and now they came and went freely between the three dwellings. However, Thomas still occupied the same room he had slept in as a boy, before the war. He sat on his bed and reflected on the two lives he had just taken. Those men were the first he had killed since France. What surprised him was not how he felt, but how he didn't feel. There was no remorse in his heart for taking the lives of his former lover's relatives. Greta was gone. Even when he closed his eyes, he struggled to remember the details of her face. France had washed them away. Thomas looked up when a knock sounded at his door. "Thomas," Polly's harsh voice sounded through the walls. "Could you come downstairs, please? I want a word." Her footsteps echoed throughout the house as she walked away. Thomas sighed. Polly always wanted to talk. When he entered the living room, Polly was sat in her usual seat, cigarette in hand, wearing her usual frown. Thomas didn't think he had seen her smile since he'd returned to Small Heath a month ago. Then again, he hadn't smiled either. Polly waited patiently until Thomas took a seat at the table and lit his own cigarette. For a few moments, they stared at each other, and neither said a word. Then Polly tapped her cigarette over the ashtray and began what Thomas knew would be a lecture. "Some of the wives are saying their husbands get better when they talk about France. So, let's talk." Thomas looked blankly at his aunt. "I have business, Pol," he said. "No time for talking." He made to stand up and Polly placed a hand on his arm. He was reminded of a moment, years before, after his mother had died, and Polly was the only adult left in the house. He had sat at this very table, grieving over his loss, and his aunt had comforted him. He decided to give her something small, and hopefully she would leave it at that. "Fine," he said. He stood up and leaned against the fireplace, staring into the flames. At the Somme, he paused and cleared his throat. At the Somme, the retreat was sounded. But we were too far forward. We got cut off. We knew that when the enemy came, we'd be dead men. We'd run out of ammo, just fucking sitting ducks. We all died then, Pol. The enemy never came, but we still fucking died. And for some reason, the Shelby boys were spared. He sighed. Good talk, he finished. Polly groaned and swept out of the room, slamming the door behind her. I know I don't show it, Pol, Thomas said after she had left, but I missed you more than anyone. Part 3. October 1919. Thomas loved the way the people parted for him as he passed, as if he were Moses splitting the sea. He gained a fierce satisfaction from the way they avoided his eyes. He was no danger to them if they stayed out of his way. He was a generous king of small Heath. The district of Birmingham arguably belonged to the Peaky Blinders, although they reluctantly shared control with the Italian and Irish gangs. Even they, however, knew not to anger Thomas and his brothers, who had re-established their reputation for violence since returning from France. The Shelbys took what they wanted, be it pubs, contraband goods, houses, or lives. But it was not enough. Thomas wanted more. He had convinced Arthur that, for the good of the business, he should take control. He had told Arthur that enforcement was his strength, and should therefore be his focus. But the truth of it was that Arthur's vision was too small, his intellect too limited. He lacked the capacity to take the Shelby family further. Thomas had so many ideas for expansion. He knew he risked the wrath of Billy Kimber if he fixed a race, but he had thought through his plan all the way to the end. Fixing a race would be the only way to capture the man's attention and allow Thomas to form an alliance. Currently, the Peaky Blinders only took bets on races from the Shelby house. Having permanent bookmaker pitches at racetracks would massively increase their earning potential. But for that to happen, Thomas needed to win the approval of Kimber. As he walked through Small Heath, scattering people in his wake, Thomas asked himself again why he did it all. He felt nothing. There was no excitement when he succeeded, no fear when he faced risk. France had stripped it all away. He supposed all that was left was hunger. Hunger for more. In the 2 months since he had returned, the Shelby Empire had grown in increments. He wondered if it would ever be big enough for him. Thomas felt it coming. His head was starting to fill up too much. He could sense the Italian ghosts on the edges of his vision, waiting for him to fall asleep so they could attack him again. He needed to relieve the pressure. There were only 2 things that did the job: opium or a whore. He would pick whichever was presented first. As if his thoughts alone had attracted her, Thomas spotted Lizzie Stark on a street corner. She looked the same as always, a seductive smile hiding the pain Thomas knew she felt. No woman could do that job and feel good about it, he told himself. He approached her and met her eyes. "Morning, Lizzie," he said, taking a cigarette from his pocket and lighting it. "Tommy," Lizzie replied. She did not look happy to see him. He was not surprised. Their previous interactions had had no warmth to them, and while Thomas never intended to harm her, he was not gentle. It was not love, after all. It was a transaction, and he paid her well. "Your place?" Lizzie asked. "No," Thomas said. "A hotel." He didn't care if Aunt Polly knew he was fucking whores, but she would take issue with him bringing them to the family home. Finn was still too young to understand such things. Without another word, Thomas continued walking and Lizzie fell into step beside him. The men they passed knew exactly what was about to happen, but they dared not look up and acknowledge it. Thomas nodded to himself. Fear was useful. Thomas threw money at the reception desk when they reached the hotel, and the smartly dressed man behind it stammered a greeting. "Welcome, Mr. Shelby. How many nights will you be staying?" "Just the one," Thomas replied. "The usual room." "Of course, Mr. Shelby," the man said. "I'll have a porter take you—" "No need," Thomas interrupted. "I know where it is. Just give me the fucking key." The receptionist quickly pressed the key into Thomas's hands, and Thomas turned away without another word, Lizzie following obediently behind. As soon as he had shut the hotel room's door behind them, Thomas pushed Lizzie over the bed. The ghosts were creeping closer, Italians screaming in his face, pressed so close he could feel the heat from their skin. As Thomas lifted Lizzie's dress and entered her, the ghosts shrank back and he breathed a sigh of relief. For this short period, he was free from them.